Banditos, welcome to another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have another big interview for you. It is with Scott Dunbier, who you may know as an editor, in fact, the editor-in-chief of Wildstorm back in the day, then an editor at DC, introducing America's Best Comics by Alan Moore, that imprint, as well as the Absolute editions. He's been for the past 12 years at IDW, where he's introduced the artist editions, which are a big hit, and then just made some waves for leaving IDW and announcing that he will be starting his own publishing company. So we dig into all of that and all of his career on this interview, and we must congratulate him on a number of Eisner Award nominations for 2024. We'll get into that in the outro, but for now, let's get to it. This is Scott Dunbier. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
No worries. We're glad to have you. So we're going to kick you off with the same question we do for all of our guests, which is, how did you first discover comic books?
There are a couple of different answers to that. The first comics I remember were when I was 5 years old in 1968, at a convenience store on the island of Aruba. We were there on vacation, and I found some comics at a local or in the hotel convenience store, and I just sat there by myself and read 3 or 4 of them.
Do you remember which they were?
I have a recollection of, I think it was Action 367 or 368, had Superman flying towards a domed city in Florida, and Supergirl was saying, "Superman, don't hit the invisible barrier or it will blow up the city." And Superman said, "Great Scott, at the speed I'm traveling, I can't possibly stop in time." And even as a kid, I was thinking, he can say all that, but he can't stop. But anyway, and then later, when I was a kid, living in New York City, there was a comic shop called Super Snipe, and that was literally halfway between my school and our apartment. And so it was just natural. Every day I would go to the comic shop and, pick up a comic.
Makes sense. And fast forward a little bit, how did you then kind of get into the comics world or the comics industry, as it were? I understand that you were first an art dealer. Is that right?
I was. And before I sold artwork, I sold comics. I used to go to shows. I would set up and sell comics, and then eventually I worked in comic shops. By the time, I don't know, I was probably 16 years old, I worked at a place called East Side Comics. My friend Vince owned it, over on 82nd Street in New York City, and I would literally open the shop every day when I got out of school at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was sort of the de facto manager in a way. Not really. I was more of just the guy who showed up first and opened up the store. And then, I worked at a couple of comic shops, and I got interested in artwork from a very early age, and I started buying art and then selling art, and wound up doing that eventually full time, selling art.
And so I'm not sure how long you were in that part of the industry, but at some point you made a jump or a leap to editorial. I don't know if that was at Wildstorm or before Wildstorm. Can you, when was that in the chronology of Scott Dunbier?
My my first job for a comic company was actually Quality Comics in 1986 in London. I had sort of moved to England on the spur of the moment because, I was 23 years old. And so I moved to London and I got a job working in the production department of Quality Comics. They were doing Judge Dredd reprints. And I met a lot of people there who are to this day very close friends of mine. I became good friends with a guy named Gary Leach, who's the co-creator of Marvel Man, then later called Miracle Man, with Alan Moore. And then I went back to the States. I started selling more and more art, and then I became a pretty successful art dealer, doing that until 1995. And Jim Lee had we were friends, and he had offered me a job for a few years working at Wildstorm, and eventually I took him up on it in 1995, and or in 1994, and then I moved out in 1995. And I was going to do a number of different things. I was going to do art sales and prints, and I did that a little bit, but I somehow wound up editing a couple of comics because I I kept on suggesting to Jim Lee that he should try to hire different people. He should diversify the talent that he had. Everybody seemed to be drawing very much like Jim Lee. And so I said, we already have Jim Lee. Why don't we get somebody else? And so eventually he said, okay, so much, you edit a book. And so I edited a couple of books, and then I became special projects editor. And then bizarrely, he made me editor-in-chief about a year later. And that was sort of the start of my editorial career.
Wow. Lots to unpack there, but the Jim Lee connection, I assume that came through your art dealing days. Is that right?
Yeah, Jim and I became friends. I never sold his artwork. He had an art dealer, and they worked together for a number of years. But now Jim was just a friend of mine. We hit it off on a number of different levels, and he saw something in me that he thought I would be good to come out to California. And so I did. I packed up and I moved to California, and yeah, so that's basically it.
Never look back. So you became, if not right off the bat, but eventually the special projects editor. I actually worked for a short time in special projects at Marvel, so I know a little bit about what those projects can be, which is kind of anything and everything that's not regular comics. But what were the kinds of things you were working on as special projects editor?
The first book I did was a Gen 13 Max crossover that Bill Loebs wrote and Tom Coker drew. Jim suggested that one because I'm good friends with Sam Keith. And then after that, I did a book called Gen 13 Ordinary Heroes, which was written and drawn by Adam Hughes, who did a terrific job. And then after that, I wound up becoming special projects editor, and I did a book called Gen 13 Bootleg that was sort of like Legends of the Dark Knight kind of book. And then I would do things here and there. I guess, you know, some of the early, really big books I did, I brought in Alan Moore after the implosion at I'm sorry, at Awesome Comics. And then I was involved very early in the Cliffhanger books, Planetary Authority, stuff like that. I did a lot of work with that with Warren Ellis, a terrific writer who I think did his best work at Wildstorm. Yeah, like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing slate of work, and yeah, some of those books I think still have, influence and ramifications today. So kudos. I assume that's, why Jim Lee gave you the big EIC job, that, things were just, the output was so, the quality of that was so spectacularly good. Was there a, level up in terms of responsibility and pressure once you got the sort of big banana job?
The only real pressure came when Jim sold the company to DC. Then it became a much more corporate place. It was not, I'm not the most corporate guy in the world. And so, there were a lot of great people at DC, then and now. And they do wonderful work, but, it was not quite always my thing.
Yeah. You sort of assumed my next question, which was about the changes at Wildstorm once DC took over. Was it sort of an immediate shift that you felt, or just sort of over time, sort of more and more maybe rules and regulations came in from the home office?
It was gradual, but it's we eventually acclimated, and I mean, there are still people there to this day from the old Wildstorm days.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to talk about, and you'll have to correct me. I'm not sure if this started before the DC sale or after, but Alan Moore's America's Best Comics, which was another imprint, I guess, like Cliffhanger, that Wildstorm was sort of a subsidiary of Wildstorm. What was the genesis of that line? How did it sort of come about?
It's kind of a funny story. In 1997, I was in New York. I was in New York for a Danger Girl signing. It was me and Jeff Campbell, J. Scott Campbell, Alex Garner, and we were doing store appearances. And I got an email from Brandon Peterson, who at the time was drawing one of the Alan Moore books at Awesome. And Brandon said he needed some work. And so I said, I thought you had, a steady gig that you were doing stuff at Awesome with Alan. And he said that he had just heard that Awesome was closing down shop, that they were going to cease publishing the books. And so we got on the phone, and he told me that he just found out. And I said, okay, let me think about this. And so, it was probably at this time like midnight, in New York. And I the next morning at 5, well, I stayed up until 5 o'clock in the morning because the time difference, it was 5 hours ahead in England. And so I called up Alan, and I remember I actually went out to a payphone on the street because I didn't want to have a giant bill for the phone in my hotel room. I guess I could have put it on my company card, but I didn't think about that. And so instead I just put, the call on my card from the payphone. And I called up Alan and I said to him, I said, "Hey, Alan, it's Scott. I hope you're doing okay." And he said, "Oh, yeah, Scott, I'm good. Thank you." And I said, "I'm just calling to see if you're interested in doing any work." And he said, "Oh, thank you, Scott. But I'm really loving all these books I'm doing at Awesome." And I and I said to him, um, "You haven't heard." And he basically said, "Heard what?" And I told him, I said, "Well, I got a call a few hours ago from Brandon, and he told me that Awesome had contacted him and told him to stop working." And so he was shocked. And I said, "Alan, I'd love to have you do something at Wildstorm, either one book or several books, whatever you want to do." And at that point, my predecessor, Mike Heisler, had already purchased the rights to do League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. So that wasn't part of this. That was already established. And so, but I said to him, whatever you want to do, we'd love to talk to you and we'd love to do something with you. And so he told me to call him back in a few hours. And I did. And he said that he had gotten confirmation that the line was ceasing to exist. And so I asked him if he'd like to talk about doing some books. And he said that I told him I was in New York and on the East Coast for the next week, but when I got back to California, it would be great to talk. And he basically said that sometime soon I'd be getting a proposal. And sure enough, I got a week later, I got a message from a receptionist at our offices, and she told me to come to the front. And I had a long 10-page fax, and it was the blueprint of the America's Best Comics line.
Was your head blown off by the fact that not only did he want to do a book, but he wanted to do an entire line of books? I mean, that's kind of a amazing feature.
Honestly, that's what I was hoping for, because he was doing an entire line with Awesome.
It's true.
So, in my head, I was thinking one or two, but I was hoping for three or four, and we did four. Actually, eventually we even did more, because we did a graphic novel, we did an additional book. We we did a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing amount of stuff, and an amazing amount of stuff for one person to write. Was there, I mean, it's looked back on obviously fondly, and as well it should, because it was, again, just the quality was off the charts. But at the time, was it difficult to coordinate all of those issues, all of those titles? And with Alan just sort of, I would imagine he's just cranking out scripts constantly.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of help. I had a couple of assistant editors, um, Jeff Marriott for a while, a guy named Eric DeSantis. I had a wonderful assistant named Christy Quinn, who to this day is working at DC, and she was just great and still is. Todd Klein was always a pleasure to work with and very helpful, not just with lettering, but also with designing different things. And Alan was a workhorse. We would work out schedules, and a lot of times he would turn in scripts, 5 to 8 pages at a time, because he was doing so much.
Yeah.
But it was not as hard as it might sound like.
Well,
It was a
I
lot
mean,
of fun.
it seemed seamless from the sort of production standpoint. I mean, I remember picking up the issues on time all the time and being thrilled with them. So, one of your other major milestones, I guess, at DC was introducing the Absolute line of, prestige hardcovers. Um, how did you pitch those, I guess? I mean, what was your, you know, pitch to the higher ups that we should be doing a different format of trade paperback or graphic novel? I mean, it's really something beyond those two.
Um, it was pretty easy actually. When do you remember the do you remember the Travis Charest X-Men Wildcats book?
Yes.
There was a French edition of that was a hardcover, oversized, on really nice paper. And we got comps in, and I looked at it, and it was beautiful. And my friend and one of the editors who was working for me, John Lehman, and I were looking at this, and we were like, "Holy shit! We should do books like this," And then it kind of grew out of that. And I don't really remember the process. Excuse me. I don't remember the process of having it approved. It didn't seem to be that difficult that I recall, but I might just be blocking it out. But yeah, it was it worked out really well. The first book I think was The Authority, and then after that we did Planetary, we did League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. One of the books that I was really happy to work on was a couple of years later. We did an Absolute Watchmen that was recolored following the original coloring by John Higgins. And John Higgins and Dave Gibbons were intimately involved in that. And the way I pitched it was we would then be able to update the coloring in the books, because the original coloring, was fine for 1986, 87, but it could have been better. And so again, it's not a giant change, but if you compare the original comics to the Absolute edition, you'll see that there's a big difference in the coloring, in the style, not in the style, but in the execution. And so that's something I'm very proud of. All the Absolute editions were nice, and it's kind of fun that they've become sort of a standard.
Yeah, I think almost an expectation of when it's a special story that they get a little bit better treatment, not only in sort of the production value, but correct me if I'm wrong, did you have sort of extras in the back of these books as well?
I always like to load up books with fun things. The League book had Alan Moore scripts in them, which that was definitely cool. Each book would have its own bits and pieces. The Absolute Danger Girl was a nice one because not only did it have extras, but every copy was signed by Jeff Campbell. So yeah, they were fun.
Was there ever any competition, or did you get a lot of requests from people to make something into an Absolute? And did you have to make choices as to who to say yes to and who not to?
It's kind of like with artist editions, people always say, "Hey, you should do this or that," and and then sometimes I think, "Oh, yeah, that would be a good book," but usually I just kind of do what I want to do. I with the Absolute books, DC sort of co-opted them, while I was there, and they took over. They did their own, like they did some really great ones, like the Darwin Cook Absolute New Frontier. That was a tremendous
Mhm.
book. So, I mean, like anything else, it's just a format. So it's not like I had total say on how to do it. But um, they they did some really good books. The Dark Knight books, the 2 volume set. Although I completely would have done a very different Promethea Absolute Edition. I think they missed a big opportunity there.
We all have regrets. um,
They should have done it horizontally, and
yes.
they should have done it as the complete Promethea. I actually worked out a pagination for it. It would have been 464 pages, 12 inches high by 16 inches wide. So all those double page spreads would have been on single pieces of paper.
What might have been? I mean, never say never. I know J.H. Williams is working on his new book in, the horizontal format, Echolands, and it looks wonderful. But I can only imagine Promethea in that format. So in 2008, you move over to IDW.
Mhm.
I'd love to know when you first move over, what your impressions of the company were, especially as compared to DC. Was it kind of a whole new ball game? Did it harken back to sort of Wildstorm days? What was it like?
Well, IDW was founded by some Wildstorm guys, and most notably Ted Adams and Robbie Robbins. And Ted Ted was very focused. He offered me a gig, and I we talked about it for a few months, and eventually I did go over there. And IDW was a great place. At that point it was very small. I think there were like 8 or 9 employees at the time. Um, the offices were very small, and then eventually we outgrew our offices. We wound up moving to Liberty Station in San Diego, and we expanded a lot, and it was a nice place to work. I mean, I owe Ted Adams, the two people I owe the most in comics are definitely Jim Lee and Ted Adams. No question about it.
And you were back there as special projects editor again. So a similar question applies. Um, what were the things that were in your domain compared to, I guess, a non-special projects editor?
It when Ted and I were talking, I remember I gave him a list. We met for lunch at this great sushi restaurant that we both love. And I gave him a list of things, and I said, okay, if you want me to come over, you should know what you're getting into. These are some of the books I'd like to do. And I said, some of them I pitched at DC, and some of them I haven't. Anything that's on this list, DC's either turned it down or I just, have wanted to do this. And he looked at the list and he said that he didn't know if we would do everything, but he said it was a great list, and that, there's nothing here that he would really want to turn down out of hand without at least considering it. And so we used to have a funny thing where I would go into Ted's office and I would say, hey, I hope you don't mind, I have this crazy idea, da, da, da. And eventually he just stopped me and he said, listen, I love hearing your crazy ideas, and so um that's when I really realized that IDW was the place for me at that time in my life.
And so we mentioned it a couple times now, the artist editions, which have, I mean, humongously grown in popularity since the first ones came out. What was, I mean, talk about a little bit about your, thinking process behind bringing those out? Was it sort of a, a version of an absolute, maybe crossed with sort of a, director's cut DVD kind of vibe? Um, what was the original
Not
thought
really. It
there?
was something else entirely to me. I mean, I had sort of been playing with the idea for a number of years, and I've been playing with the idea for a number of years. There were two basic inspirations for me. One was, do you know what an APA is? APA?
I feel like I do in the recesses of my mind, but not at the top.
It's all right. Um, Amateur Press Association. And an APA is like, a nerd fest. It's basically you have 40 to 75 people who make their own publication and they share it amongst themselves. So there's a APA called the Comic
Okay.
Fantasy Art APA. And I used to be a member of it. And there was every issue was devoted to an artist. And Neil Adams was one of my favorite artists as a kid, and so we were doing a Neil Adams issue, and they asked me to do an interview with him, so I did a long interview with Neil, and then I also, well, okay, I need to go into a little background of what an APA is. So it's like, 250 to 400 pages. Every contributor is supposed to do a contribution, and they make, with the comic art APA, you would make 60 photocopies of your contribution and then send it to a central collator who would bind it and then mail it out to everybody. Like I said, it's a very nerdy thing. And so along with my interview, I had a bunch of Neil Adams art at the time, back when I was a big collector. And some of the art I had were Neil's pencils. And when I made photocopies, they just looked terrible. And so I wound up spending an awful lot of money, because they weren't cheap back then, making color photocopies of these pages. So I did 60 of each. It cost me like $300 or $400 to do it at the time. But they looked really good. And they looked so much better than regular black and white photocopies. The other inspiration, that was the first inspiration. The other inspiration, there was a book that came out in the 90s. I forgot what it was called. Chip Kidd wrote it. It's like collecting Batman book. Also, it's sort of his collection of stuff. It has toys, comics. It also had, coincidentally, a Neil Adams page that he had photographed, and it was this page from Batman 251, the Joker issue, with Batman fighting a shark, and it was printed there, and you could literally, it looked like the art, and I thought, wow, this, I'd love to see a whole book like this. So those are the two main inspirations. And then when I went to IDW, one of the arrangements that Ted Adams and I had was, if I wanted to do something, but he felt it was a little bit too far out there, then I had the right to publish it myself on my own. And so he never took me up on that. But with the artist editions, the first one was the Dave Stevens Rocketeer artist edition, and I had brought the Rocketeer franchise to IDW, and we did like a whole new recolored version that I'm very proud of. Laura Martin colored it, beautiful job. She was Dave's choice before he died to recolor it all. And I like to think he would have been happy with the results. But the first artist edition was something completely different. You know, it was same size, it was expensive, you know, probably too expensive at the time. And I said to Ted, you know, if you don't want to do this, I'll just do it on my own somewhere else. And he said that he wanted to do it. He wanted to take a chance on it. And one of the funny things that happened, we we were initially going to sell it direct because of the cost involved. And oddly enough, that helped us because retailers were angry about that. They wanted to buy this book. They wanted to get copies themselves because they're fans of comics and art. And so there's a retailer who's a friend of mine named Cliff Biggers. He used to do Comic Shop News. Great guy and
Yep.
very smart guy. And so Cliff and I spoke. He called me up and we basically worked out what we called a courtesy discount. And so on that first book, retailers were able to order it. We did a quick solicit through Diamond, and retailers were able to order it at a 25% discount, which is higher than, you know, it's not as good a discount as they usually get, but the sales were really good. And so a year later, we did the first Marvel book we did, which was Walter Simonson's The Mighty Thor. And then a little after that, we did our first EC book, Wally Wood's EC Stories. And that was just a phenomenally popular and beautiful book, I think. And that one was the first big one, you know, and when I say big one, you know, regular artist editions are 12 by 17. That one was 15 by 22. So it was a monster. And then eventually we ramped up. There was actually one year where I think I did 13 artist editions in a year. And I didn't do them all in a year. It's just, you know, with the timing, you know, 13 of them came out in a year. It was a lot of work. And I never want to do 13 artist editions in a year again. Because, you know, if you do stuff that fast, it's going to suffer, you know, either the work or my mental health. So so that's basically how artist edition started.
You must feel very fulfilled by this, or the success of them, because they have gone on to you know, be these objects that people are, you know, very desirous of. They wait for the next one. You know, they're by all accounts thrilled by the, you know, each subsequent one. Does the success sort of ever sink in, or you ever think about, you know, that you created these and, you know, they bring a lot of joy to collectors?
You know, I love it. I mean, have you ever been to the artist edition website? Yeah, it's called A for artist, E for editions, aeindex.org. And this guy named Scott does this incredible website. I mean, and there's a message board on I forgot what it's called. It's, you know, one of those message board things. If you do a search on artist edition message boards, you'll go to it. But at this point, there are over 1,700 pages of comments on it, which is, you know, I don't even know what that equates to in terms of posts, but, you know, these guys who are into it are really into it. And, you know, honestly, I love that. You know, I mean, it sort of makes me feel reinvigorated by their enthusiasm, and they're really all a bunch of good people. You know, they love these books. I mean, sometimes they're angry at me for different reasons. But, you know, for the most part, they're all really good folks, and they love the books. Every once in a while, we actually have sort of a kind of a Zoom call chat with, like, you know, 20 or 30 of us and just talk about artist editions. Usually they're asking me questions, but we talk about other stuff too. We talk about other artist editions by other companies and things like that too. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's very gratifying that so many people are interested in these books and like them. I mean, I'll tell you one funny story. The first time I really realized that this made a big difference to people was at the WonderCon when I don't remember what book it was that came out, but as an editor, at that point I already edited a lot of books, before I went to IDW. And as an editor, people come up to you, once or twice at a show and say, "Hey, I really like that book you worked on." All of a sudden, I started getting like 50 or 60 or even 70 people coming up to me and just saying, "Wow, I love those artist editions." And that was kind of a shock to me, because like I said, an editor, it's not like I'm, you know, John Byrne or, Neil Adams, but I all of a sudden I started getting this really wonderful, gratifying praise, and it was really cool, and I appreciate all those folks. They make there are some dark days occasionally in publishing, and they generally make it more worthwhile.
Yeah, I feel like not many folks can say they not only created a format, but sort of a community around it, even though that wasn't necessarily your intention, but it seemingly has cropped up anyway. And it's great to see. It reminds me a little bit of like Criterion Collection in the film industry. And
Yeah.
that's, not only just the format and presenting it in the best possible way, but there are people talking about it, debating things, all kinds of great stuff. So I want to get to, what's next, because you did recently announce you having left IDW. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask about benefit and anthologies.
Oh,
Because, yeah.
I wasn't sure where you were going with that. Okay.
Yeah, no. Sort of the benefit, like for example, Comics for Ukraine, the Sunflower Seeds, which is one you put together or masterminded last year, which I just got, what was it, a couple months ago, and it's great. Um, is that a heavy lift coordinating something like that with, so many different contributors involved and, all over the place and getting it together to, into a cohesive piece?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. But it's incredibly gratifying. I've told the story about how I started the book. Basically I was just pissed off, by what was going on in Ukraine. And I started reaching out to some friends and just saying, "Hey, if I were to do this book, would you be interested in doing it?" Pretty much everybody said yes. And everybody was incredibly helpful. There is an old term about wrangling cats. I had more than 50 people that I was working with on this book. And there were a couple of hiccups along the way, and it took longer than I was hoping to. Um, there were a couple of stories that took very long. But at the end of the day, I mean, everybody's art was in the right place, and it was very rewarding. I actually, if you see that Wolverine cover behind me,
Yeah.
underneath it is something that I got at last year's San Diego Comic. It was the Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award, which is very humbling. It was a long process. It took from the time I conceived it to the time it was out, it was, about almost a year, or was it more? I can't remember now. When did Oh shoot. It was more than a year. Wow, that's a
Yeah.
long time. But anyway, and the people at IDW were fine. You know, I didn't want to do it at IDW because I didn't want it to, A, it would take too long, and B, I'm laughing because it took so long. And then B, I wanted to make as much money as possible for the charity. And um, Mark Evanier kindly suggested, he pointed me in the direction of Operation USA, which is a small grassroots charity, because, you know, one of the main things I did not want to do was have a charity that would have like 20% go to Ukraine and 80% go to Three Martini Lunches. And
Right.
so Mark suggested Operation USA. I urge anyone listening to this, um, even if you haven't backed Comics for Ukraine, which by the way you still can at Zoop ZOOP.gg. You can go there and buy it now. It's ready to be shipped. Different versions, including a version that has 13 signatures, which is sort of crazy, and I'll never do that again. Anyway, basically, it was a very gratifying book, and I thank everybody immensely for their work on it. I got word today from the wonderful Jackie Estrada, who is the person who runs the Eisner Awards, that Comics for Ukraine is nominated, or it'll be announced, you know, in a week or two, for Best Anthology Book. And then one of the short stories, Talking to a Hill by Larry Hancock and Michael Cherkas, for Best Short Story.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very happy about that. You know, it's again humbling.
Yeah. And congratulations on the Humanitarian Award as well. Again, you know, well deserved. I think not
That's
only
just a
the
mind blower.
I know, I'm sure. But I mean, it shows you're having an effect beyond, I think, just the quality of the product you're putting out. It's something meaningful and you know, helpful to a certain cause, and a cause that, you know, a lot of people want to get behind. So
I appreciate that. And um there are a few really good charities. I used to do stuff for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. I did a couple of charity art auctions, and also I did a book called Liberty Comics for them. And then I've also done some stuff with the Hero Initiative. That's my current favorite charity. And um, I'm about to start putting together my third auction for them that'll run in Baltimore in September. Anybody who's an art fan, there'll be a lot of great stuff, and it's for a great cause.
great. We'll send people that way, and make sure people know about it. It is really a great cause. The Hero Initiative, all the ones that you've mentioned are definitely worthy of your time and dollars. So let's move on over to kind of future plans, because as I said, you recently left IDW, and it was, you know, revealed that you're going to be starting your own publishing company. Is this something you've been thinking about for a while?
I'm not a young guy. I'm 61 years old. If I'm ever going to do it, I got to do it now. And, you know, IDW was a great home for me for a long time. I thought I was going to stay there through the end of my career. It didn't quite work out that way. You know, there've been a lot of changes at IDW, and, you know, they saw things a little bit differently than I did. And I decided to leave when we couldn't come to what I felt was a good understanding. And so, you know, I gave my notice, um, and now I'm gonna go into the crazy world of self-publishing. or publishing through my own imprint. I can't really talk about it too much though, because I do have a bunch of projects that I am planning to announce at, or at least four that I'm planning to announce at San Diego Comic-Con, possibly five. And my yeah, I'll announce probably the name of the company and my logo sometime in early June. And then my website will go live during Comic-Con. And well, it'll go live before that, but it'll actually have more information on it during Comic-Con. And then I'll announce my first books. And I have a lot of ideas. I'm hoping to do a lot of different things and a lot of similar things.
We're excited to hear all the details. Without getting into those details, I had a couple more questions about sort of your, what you're thinking, your motivations, your the purpose of the new company. The first one would be why a new publishing company instead of going somewhere else and plying your trade as you have for another great comics company that already exists.
I would follow Jim Lee anywhere. I'd follow Ted Adams anywhere. But I'm too old to, like I said, I'm not a corporate guy. I like having final say, with, you mentioned before about absolute editions and people suggesting things. I like being able to make my own mind up. I like to be able to have the final call. And so, I'm gonna just live or die on my own strengths and weaknesses. I'm betting on myself. I don't have any investors. I've been offered, a few people have kindly offered to invest. And, if it comes down to it, in a year, if I've kind of failed, if they're still interested, well, maybe I'll take them up on it. But, I honestly, my motivation is to take care of my family. And that's it. I have two main goals. I want to do books that I love, and I want to make sure that my family is taken care of. And that's really all I care about. And so I'm going to bet on myself and, fund this myself. So I guess the answer to that is I don't really want to work for anybody else anymore, unless it's Jim Lee or Ted Adams. But even in that case, that would be more working with them, not working for them.
Right.
So, and my friend John Nee also. So, Jim, if you're watching this, which I doubt you are, because you're probably off in Korea or Japan or England or France, traveling because you're the worldwide jet setter. But if you decide you want to do something, just give me a call, pal.
And if you want to come on the show, that invitation's also open, Jim. One last question, and that is, it's a crowded marketplace. Obviously, there are a lot of comics, there are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of publishers. What have you thought about, and what do you think you would say would differentiate what you're doing from all those others that are out there that would presumably be your competition?
I'm more interested in what I'm going to be doing than what they're doing. Everybody has their own way of doing it. I mean, there's some great companies out there. Boom has been doing some great stuff, and Mad Cave. But, you know, I just want to do my own books, put my head down, work. I'm literally I'm literally in the process of, I'm not going to show you what these are. I'm not going to turn them around, but I have a stack that high of artwork that I'm scanning for something that isn't going to be one of my projects, but I'm related to it. It's something I'm doing to help out some people. But I'm just going to do the stuff that I like doing. I'm going to try my best to do things that I like, and I find that the only time I've ever had any real failure is when I've sort of bowed to the market rather than my own taste. I mean, I remember when I was an art dealer, I would only buy stuff that I liked, and if it didn't sell, that was fine because at least I liked it. Whereas
Right.
there were a couple of times where I bought stuff because, oh, it's a Batman series and I didn't like the art really. I'm not going to mention the artist, but I remember when that stuff didn't sell, I was pissed off at myself for not listening to my own instincts. And and then I wound up just, dumping it, just because I didn't like it. I didn't want to have it in my house.
So if it excites you, you're hoping and assuming that it will excite a lot of other people, which given your track record, it seems like a pretty good bet.
I think I have fairly good tastes. Um, One thing that I did back in the 90s when I was still an art dealer, I made a deal. I read a book, a new comic, and I knew the artist, and I called him up and I said, I love this book. I want to buy every page from now on. And it was, an ongoing series. I mean, it was, and there was no track record on this, but I loved it. And I knew other people would love it too. And that was Preacher. I I bought all of Steve Dillon's Preacher art. And it was great and that was also kind of an inspiration for artist editions as well, because I stopped buying the comic. And every time I would get a new issue, I would read it, on the original art. And so that's actually another inspiration, to tell you the truth. But I love that stuff, and it was so great.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. It was a great pleasure and honor to interview the one, the only Scott Dunbier. I really enjoyed hearing a lot more about his career. He has a great eye for talent. He has an amazing eye for format, introducing, these bigger, better, more vibrant editions of books and artists we know and love. And in fact, he is being rewarded for that many times over already, but also for the 2024 Eisner Awards, where he is somewhat or directly responsible for 3 nominations. Story Talking to a Hill, that comes from Comics from Ukraine, which Dunbier edited and compiled, and that is a story by Larry Hancock and Michael Chekas. Also, Best Anthology for the same compilation, Comics for Ukraine. And thirdly, for the Best Archival Collection Project for Comics, which was Michael Golden's Marvel Stories Artist Editions from IDW, Dunbier's until recent place of employment. So, the Eisners know a lot about who does a great job. And so Scott is really kind of up there in the upper echelon of editors. And we can't wait to see what his new publishing company is going to look like, some of the artists that are going to work with him, and some of the comics that are going to come out of that collaboration. But that will do it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing. Thank you for viewing if you're on YouTube. Thank you for everything that keeps this podcast going. We've got more great interviews coming up. In fact, on Friday, as usual, and then on and on from there. So we are keeping this interview train running, and we hope you are on board with us. But that'll do it, and we'll see you next issue.